Seminarau ar-lein Adran y Gymraeg ag Astudiaethau Celtaidd Prifysgol Aberystwyth. Rhianwen Daniel. The Impact of Language on National Identity. Welsh, German and Anticolonial Perspectives. The 26th of April 2022.
Iawn, wel, noswaith dda pawb. Chroeso i'r seminar yno. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to tonight's seminar from the Department of Welsh and Celtic Studies in Aberystwyth. And tonight we have Rhianwen Daniel. We're very pleased that she's come to speak to us tonight. She's a lecturer in philosophy at Cardiff University and a researcher at the Language Technologies Unit in Bangor University. She completed her PhD in politics last year, the impact of language on cultural identity, implications for linguistic justice and liberal nationalism. And she has recently published an article in Nations on Nationalism entitled The Liberal Conservative Nationalism Divide, a Distinction Without a Difference, ? And tonight her subject will be the impact of language on national identity, Welsh, German and anti-colonial perspectives. Rhianwen has said that she'll be happy to answer questions at the end of the talk. So probably the best thing to do would be if you can let me know in the chat that you'd like to ask a question, and I can then you can unmute yourself and do so, or you could just put the question in the chat and I can ask it on your behalf. I normally forget to say this at this point, so well done. I'm going to pat myself on the back for remembering this time. But anyway, in the meantime, I'll turn you over to Rhianwen.
Yeah, diolch yn fawr, Simon, and thank you very much for having me. Okay, so the idea of language as a vehicle of culture is one that I think strikes many of us as highly intuitive and resonates quite widely. It's often said that people feel as if they have different personalities while speaking different languages, and that their native language is somehow a very central part of their own personal and cultural identity. Now, according to Frantz Fanon, a man who has a language consequently possesses the world expressed and implied by that language. I think that quote captures this sentiment quite effectively. Then, according to Wilhelm von Humboldt, language is the external manifestation of the minds of the people. Their language is their soul, and their soul is their language. Then we have another quote at the far end here by J.R. Tolkien, no less, who says that languages are the chief distinguishing marks of peoples. Let the languages perish, and the peoples perish too, or become different peoples. And this idea of language as a vehicle of culture is something that we in Wales are very familiar with, and this is presumably why it's actually gained much political mileage during the past century. So thanks to the sustained campaigning of Plaid Cymru and the associated pressure group Cymdeithas yr Iaith, we now have a Welsh medium radio station, we now have the S4C, we have the Welsh Language Act of 1967 and 93, which eventually gave Welsh equal status with English in public life. And as of 2011, Welsh has been an official language in Wales. Then the latest development to add to the list is that in 2017, the Welsh government published their Welsh language strategy, which aims to achieve 1 million Welsh speakers by 2050. Now, unsurprisingly, it's not only in Wales that this idea has gained quite widespread currency. So when I was doing my PhD, I decided to look at what numerous nationalistic and anti-colonial writers had to say about this topic. And interestingly, what I found was that there were a number of recurring themes in each of these works, despite them having been written completely independently from each other, or at least fairly independently from each other. So they all tended to think that indigenous languages are the prime vehicles of culture among the native speakers. They tended to think that, their languages are authentic cultural expressions. And because of this, it was thought that the colonizer language or the neighboring dominant language was a source of cultural alienation and oppression. So let's look at a few examples. Frantz Fanon thought that it was part of the definition of imperialism that it instills an inferiority complex in every subjugated people, and that's by the death and burial of its local cultural originality. Interestingly, this death and burial of the local cultural originality was largely centered around the colonizer language being imposed upon the subjugated peoples. So imposing a colonizer language, according to Fanon, forces the subject peoples to adopt and participate in the colonizer's worldview at the expense of their own. And he says, to speak a language is to take on a world, a culture. Now, the problem with this, on Fanon's view, is that because it's the colonizer's language, that language embodies a sense of superiority in relation to the colonized people's language. So by virtue of them being forced to speak that language, the subjugated peoples are basically forced to internalize this sense of inferiority. So it's not a particularly pleasant state of affairs by the look of it. Yeah, so similarly, Albert Memmi, the French-Tunisian anti-colonial writer, said in a similar vein that the colonizer language is the one that's used for generally all educational, industrial, technological or bureaucratic purposes, while the native language is marginalized from public life. And this is not only during imperial rule, but also after decolonization. Generally the dominant former colonizer's language is the one that persists in public life. So the continuing effect of this is that the indigenous languages become inferiorized due to their subordinated status. And this causes people to develop a sense of shame about their mother tongue and thereby internalize a sense of inferiority assigned to it by the former colonizer. So there we have another expression of this inferiority complex problem. Again, we see a recurring theme in Plaid Cymru's influential statements. So according to Saunders Lewis, Plaid Cymru's chief aim was to remove from the Welsh their inferiority complex, eradicate from our country the mark and disgrace of her conquest. Now, what this actually leads to, according to a slightly later writer, J.R. Jones, who was, I would say, one of the main intellectual influences on Cymdeithas yr Iaith. So it leads to the cultivation and internalization of an inferiority complex. And this results in self-deprecation and an excessive preparedness to conform. So again, we have this quote from Albert Memmi saying that basically this causes an internal cultural rift within the subject peoples, because actually it's the native language that tends to carry the emotional weight and the cultural spontaneity. But the subordination of that language from public life crushes this. So he says that to get ahead, to gain a remotely decent job or to gain socioeconomic respect, one has to become disconnected from their native tongue. And what this causes is a cultural catastrophe, not just for individuals, but also for the collective expression of that culture, and crucially, including the creative arts. Saunders Lewis, who is effectively, for anybody who might not know, the chief founder of Plaid Cymru, actually said something very similar about Wales, and this is what drew him to Welsh nationalism in the first place. So Saunders Lewis was a Nobel Prize nominee for literature, and he saw the need to return to his own cultural roots in order to, acquire enough cultural authenticity to grow as an artist. So that's a personal reason for him to, approach Welsh nationalism. But he actually saw his own fate as a writer as being inextricably connected to the fate of the Welsh language, because the continuation of the Welsh language was necessary for, well, just for example, his own literature to persist and persist in having an audience even. Okay, so the two are connected. Now, a third theme on top of this sense that somehow, the colonizer language or the neighboring dominant language causes cultural stiflement is actually a trend where some writers have taken this idea one step further and claimed that it can also cause moral and spiritual degeneration. So here's a passage from J.R. Jones's book, Prydeiндod, effectively trying to give a description of some of the psychological consequences of the Anglicisation of Wales. So he says, imagine a countryside girl coming into the town of Carmarthen to work. She was raised in an expressive Welsh, which gave us a mental breadth. But in the town, she tries to conceal the fact that she is Welsh and turns to speaking an impoverished English slang, meagre in resources, which stifles her spirit, debases her sensibilities, and shrinks her mind until she melts in the end into the unvaried and vacuous swarm of pop songs and betting papers. Dear me. Yeah, so you'll be pleased to know it's not only Welsh writers who have made such a claim. There are also historical precedents to this in the works of Fichte, for example, writing in the early 19th century. So he distinguished between primitive and derived languages and thought that the incursion of too many French loanwords into the German language somehow created a degree of corruption and perversion to the German language. So this sounds extremely prejudiced, and it is, but you have to remember that the final German state that hadn't yet been steamrolled by Napoleon had just been defeated by Napoleon's army. So they were in a pretty desperate state of mind at the time. So his reason for decrying the prevalence of loanwords was that actually French is a very etymologically mixed language with Latin roots. As you know, what we now call France was part of the Roman Empire. So the Gaulish language or dialect that preceded the Latinization of French basically became intermixed with very, very strong Latin influences. And then this language shift was compounded when later on Germanic tribes invaded France, and the kind of Roman/Gaulish language that was spoken then became further intermixed with Germanic dialects. So the result of this, according to Fichte, is basically for the French to have lost their cultural authenticity and develop in its place a cultural and moral degradation, such as the lack of seriousness about social relations, the idea of self-abandonment, and the idea of heartless laxity. So speaking a language with too many loan words and too many loan translations, especially when the roots of those words are etymologically opaque, so to speak, means that that language gets severed from its living root and thereby enshrouds the hearer in darkness and incomprehensibility. So that's Fichte's take on, yeah, too many loan words from French being adopted by the Germans. Okay, so in all of these accounts, we see the idea of language as a very major vehicle of culture being used to justify, the inferiority complex, the idea that having another language imposed on you somehow causes you to lose your cultural spontaneity and integrity, and also in some cases causes some degree of moral degeneration as well. So all of these accounts are driven by the idea that language is a vehicle of culture. So the question I have, or the question I had when I started my PhD, so to speak, is what exactly is the basis of this cultural linguistic link? Since it's gained so much political mileage, surely there must be some kind of a justification for it. Well, I didn't find the justification in any of the political literature, but I did later on in linguistics and philosophy texts, but I'll get onto that in a moment. So the reason I think it's important to examine the basis of the cultural linguistic link is because actually not everybody accepts the idea that language is a major vehicle of culture. So you often hear objections like, well, it's a waste of money to promote a minority language. If language is just a communication device, then surely we can use any language. And what does it matter? We all have limited resources to spend. Surely we could, divert that money to more worthy causes like, I don't know, homelessness or child poverty, you name it. So I think, yeah, this is a very common objection that you hear, at least in Wales, presumably in other multilingual countries as well. And thinking about it in the Welsh context, you can see why it has gained, that much prevalence, because let's be honest, fewer than a third of the Welsh population speak Welsh. And then according to a fairly recent Welsh election study, only 27% of respondents saw the Welsh language as an important part of Welsh identity. And on top of this, only 3% thought it was the most important part of Welsh identity. So this is why, we need to examine whether there's a justification for this or not. First of all, before I go into the more linguistics side of things, I'd like to mention that surely there's something missing from these objections. So people do go to quite extreme lengths to fight for, language recognition and language rights. So if we look at the Bengali language movement, so students were actually martyred in East Bengal when they were trying to establish Bengali as the official language. Surely if language was just a communication device, then they wouldn't have been willing to go to such lengths. Then recently, I was also watching a video of when the Bible was actually translated into Jamaican patois, at least the New Testament. And the video showed the minister and the congregants just being absolutely overjoyed by this. They were saying that, this made the text come alive to them. And that it was almost as if having Christ speaking to them in their own mother tongue on the street. So the sense of joy that it generates doesn't seem to be explicable by the idea that language is just any mode of communication and one is as good as the other. And then similarly, when Gwynfor Evans threatened to go on a hunger strike and threatened to starve himself to death in 1980 while trying to fight for the establishment of the S4C, I don't think he would have been willing to do that if, again, language was just a communication device and nothing else. That would be very whimsical and deranged, I think. So yeah, we do need to examine this in more detail. Well, fortunately, I do have an explanation for you. And this is a position in linguistics called linguistic relativity. And this is defined in the following way. So the semantic structures of different languages might be fundamentally incommensurable, such that language, thought, and culture are deeply interlocked. Okay, so this means that language is a repository of its speakers' culture-specific traditions, sensibilities, practices, and values. So I think this takes us some way to understanding why people go to such lengths to fight for their own indigenous language. So to see how this works, I'm going to start by using a few common sense examples of how this can be seen in English. So take the two expressions, break the ice and faint-hearted. Well, these originally come from Shakespeare. Break the ice comes from The Taming of the Shrew, and faint-hearted comes from Henry VI. Now, these are just common English expressions that we all use. Most of us don't even know that they come from Shakespeare, but the fact that, you know, Shakespeare's work was so influential as to become embodied in ordinary English is, in a way, a mirror to the historical past of English speakers, because of these literary innovations are reflected in the language. And similarly, the expression taken aback, well, this was originally coined in a naval context. So when a ship was taken aback, this was a situation where there was a sudden change in the direction of the wind, and then the sails were blown back against the masts, which caused the ship to jar, and then people were literally physically taken aback by it. So again, this is a manifestation of the prominence of the British Navy in English history. And I could, you know, cite millions of other examples, but I'll stop there. Now, in addition to these common sense examples, my work on linguistic relativity and my analysis of it revealed that to get this into more clear perspective, we need to recognize that there are two necessary conditions to the position. And these are simply, first of all, there are differences in conceptual repertoires across languages. And secondly, the inextricability of language and thought. Okay, so the first necessary condition, this refers to basically the lack of conceptual equivalence in the source and target language. So in translation studies, this is called the problem of untranslatability. And I'd like to specify from the outset that I don't mean literal untranslatability, because, you know, how would machine translation work and how would the whole industry of translation and interpretation work if things couldn't be translated? They obviously can. What I mean is that many cultural nuances become lost in translation. So to give a few examples, Schadenfreude. This is the German word that's widely used in English as well for a certain sense of pleasure derived from another person's misfortune, with slightly different connotations. Then in, I don't know, New Testament scholarship, it's common knowledge that words like love in ancient Greek are just very, very like diverse and expansive compared with the English counterparts. So in the ancient Greek, there are different near synonyms for love, which distinguish between different degrees of affection, for example, but these can't really be captured in the blanket English term, love. So again, these become quite lost in translation. Then another example is Latin, which has God knows how many words for killing. So interficere tends to be used in the context of battles. Mortificare means effectively to make dead. And then trucidare, to use another example, is to butcher or massacre. So clearly they had a bit of a fixation with different styles of killing. Okay, so that is the first necessary condition of linguistic relativity, and I think we can all relate to it fairly well, at least. So what is the second one? Well, that's the inextricability of language and thought. So to fully understand this, I think we should start by looking at the opposite view, which comes from British empiricism, especially the works of John Locke and David Hume. So on this British empiricist view, language is seen as an instrumental device which encodes information and is, at least in principle, detachable from thought. So according to this theory, all mental states are comprised of ideas which are derived from sense perception and then stored in memory. So how does this work? Well, external stimuli impinge on our senses, then our minds store a copy of the objects perceived, and then we psychologically summon those copies in all future instances when we think of the objects. So that does sound a bit abstract, but let me illustrate with a simple example of the color red, for example. So on this view, we'll perceive the color red for the first time, and then that imprints itself upon our minds, and our minds store a copy of that in the form of an idea. So we have the concept of red, and then whenever we think about red without perceiving it, we psychologically summon that copy of the image. So on this account, language and thought are actually independent from each other, as opposed to inextricable from each other. And that's because words are just labels for ideas. So the word red would be just a simple label for the idea of red. So ideas are prior to language rather than, interconnected with it on this account. This also means that conceptual understanding just consists in connecting words and ideas with each other. And this is incompatible with linguistic relativity because it treats language as, in principle, independent from thought. And as we've seen, the second necessary condition of linguistic relativity is the inextricability of language and thought. So how do we deal with this? Well, luckily, the philosopher Wittgenstein did develop some fairly decisive objections towards it. So what his arguments cumulatively proved effectively is that thought is just actually not equivalent to the activation of mental images in any shape or form, whether they're crude traditional ones or more subtle representationalist accounts. So his arguments are very complex, so I'm afraid I haven't got time to go into the precise, minute details in this talk, but let's just satisfy ourselves with a few considerations, which I think do illustrate the unfeasibility of this idea. So if ideas are equivalent to effectively mental images, then just think about a situation where you're giving a very complex speech full of, say, qualifiers and subordinate clauses. Say you're talking for an hour, articulating some complex philosophical argument. Well, how could this endless reel of images catch up with the content of the speech? It's just not really plausible. Even though in isolated cases, it might seem to make sense. I think about red, and in a way I have a mental image of red. You just can't generalize this across the whole of language. And then secondly, pictures actually don't interpret themselves, and they don't contain their meaning intrinsically because they have to be interpreted. So think about a picture of somebody kneeling down, for example. This could represent somebody praying, exercising, engaging in an act of submission, tripping up, a whole different array of possibilities. So you actually can't generally know the meaning of the picture unless you know the context of it and the cultural meanings that we just conventionally assign to the different aspects. So they're not self-sufficient, as it were. And then finally, the other objection I'd like to explain in this regard is that if it was true that, again, ideas and thoughts are just complexes of mental images, then how would we be able to know that we have the same ones when we use the same words? Because if ideas are just mental images that we have in the privacy of our own mind, then, you know, when I say the color red, as far as I'm aware, you might understand something different by the term because I can't see into your mind. These mental images are only accessible to you. So if you push this to its consequences, it would mean that everybody could be talking at cross purposes regularly and basically be none the wiser about it. Obviously, this can't be true because we know from common sense that it's not. Otherwise, how would life work effectively? So yeah, that's another shortcoming of the empiricist view, British empiricism, that is. So if linguistic meaning and linguistic understanding is not equivalent to just connecting words with ideas in your own mind, then what is it? Well, Wittgenstein had an answer to this as well, which is that a meaning of a word is its use in language. So what this effectively boils down to is that, being able to speak a language competently in line with social practices and conventions is actually what determines their meanings and standards for use. So let's just think of an example of a situation where we can ordinarily conclude that somebody has misunderstood a word. So suppose, you know, somebody who used the word pain just typically ascribed the word to, I don't know, people who were engaged in bricklaying or plumbing or playing the piano, just to use a few examples. If they consistently did that, we would have no hesitation in judging that he or she had misunderstood the concept. And that is precisely because their use of the term deviates from ordinary conventional use. And this is generally applicable to language more broadly. Language, it's interwoven with forms of life and culture. You know, forms of life and culture, they are what give language its meaning in different contexts. And the outcome of this is that it's just false, that thought is independent of language and culture, as British empiricism would have us think. So at this point, some of you might be thinking, well, British empiricism, that was, you know, prominent in the 17th century. So haven't we moved beyond that now? Isn't it a bit of a red herring to bring it into this discussion? No, it's not actually, because the legacy of it persists, not just in many people's common sense when they think that language is just a communication device and nothing else, but also in some theories in modern linguistics, like some Chomskyan linguistics and some of his descendants, effectively. And that is another topic which I addressed in my PhD, but I would deviate if I went into it in much detail here. But the conclusion that I drew on the basis of the further research undertaken was that actually most of the most compelling empirical evidence in this regard shows that, yeah, Chomskyan linguistics is false. And also there are some clear examples of how in certain cultures, there's no other explanation other than linguistic meaning just is use. So I don't know if some of you have heard about the anthropologist Daniel Everett, but he conducted very extensive research on this Amazonian tribe called the Piraha. And these people had no concept of numbers, no numerals. They didn't have any color terms, perfect tense, individual or collective memory of more than 2 generations ago. So this is very, very radical. And the reason for this was because it's part of their culture to be completely in the moment. Because if they weren't, they probably wouldn't survive, because they'd be vulnerable to being eaten by anacondas and other predators. So they have what Daniel Everett calls an immediacy of experience constraint on their language. So interestingly, Daniel Everett originally went into the Amazon to evangelize to the Piraha, and he wanted to translate the Bible into their language effectively. So he spent decades studying the language, but found it to be a bit of an uphill battle, because when he was trying to explain the existence of Christ 2 millennia ago, well, first of all, they didn't understand numbers, so they couldn't grasp the concept of 2 millennia, but also because of the immediacy of experience constraint, they just couldn't get their heads around how, Daniel Everett knew about Jesus, because they kept asking things like, well, have you seen him? Where is he? I can't see any evidence in my environment. So what are you talking about effectively? Yeah, so that didn't go according to plan, needless to say. So what this example illustrates is that linguistic meaning, as I said, boils down to use, because the Piraha have no use whatsoever for concepts of, several generations ago. They don't have any use for numbers even, because everything is relative. And then because of this, their language reflects it, and they can't really think beyond that, because, we think in language. Okay, so I hope that's collectively given you enough food for thought in substantiating linguistic relativity, especially the 2 necessary conditions I mentioned of untranslatability and the inextricability of language and thought. So we started out by looking at how the idea of language as a vehicle of culture has been central to nationalist and anti-colonial movements. And it's also foundational to much of the political rhetoric that we see in this regard. But like I said, this idea is not universally accepted at all. Plenty of people think that investing in multilingual language policies is just a waste of money, and all that time and effort and expenses would be better invested in more worthy causes. So this means that we need some kind of a justification, or some analytic or empirical materials for being able to look at what the justifications are and evaluate, what priorities trump others. And my own line is that linguistic relativity provides this justification, which can then be used to add value to these debates. So I think if you're interested in language rights and language policy and planning and the ethics surrounding it, then this could be quite a useful tool. And I hope it's going to open up a bit more interdisciplinary debate and collaboration. Looking into these questions. Okay, so thank you very much. And I look forward to receiving your questions.
Diolch yn fawr iawn, Rhianwen, diddorol tu hwnt. Mae'n siŵr bydd yna gwestiynau. Thanks for a wonderfully interesting discussion. And I'm sure that there are questions there. If anybody would like to ask Rhianwen a question, please do. Well, I think I can more or less see you all now. The slides have gone, so if you raise your hand or something, then that I could call on you to unmute and ask a question, or you can send a message in the chat. either with a question for me to ask on your behalf or to say that you'd like to ask a question. Maybe while you're thinking about questions, I could just ask a quick one, Rhianwen. I mean, I found your case very persuasive, really, and it's. I mean, it's very interesting to sort of see the theory that underpins some things which perhaps I'd grasped in a rather less intellectual way, or whatever. But one thing which strikes me is the question of national identity. I mean, as you mentioned, at the beginning of the talk, only less than a third of the Welsh population speak Welsh. So, I mean, of course, historically, you don't have to go very far back in the case of most people who aren't recent immigrants into Wales to find that they have family connections with the language and so on. But if we're looking at things in terms of sort of inextricability of language and thought, and sort of thinking in terms of the quote that you had at the beginning from Tolkien saying that people, people cease to be or they become different people and so on. Are we really talking here about something that's relevant to Wales as a political entity or a geographical entity, or are we talking about something that's only really relevant to people that speak Welsh? If so, are we going to start tying ourselves in knots talking about, whether people are really Welsh or not, depending on what language they speak?
Yeah, excellent question. And that is precisely why I use the title, The Impact of Language on Cultural Identity, as opposed to national identity in my thesis. So, what comprises national identity? Well, this depends largely on how we define nation in the first place, doesn't it? Because this is a bit of a weasel word in many contexts. So America is defined as a nation, so is Wales. Iceland is a very culturally and linguistically homogenous unit. That's a nation. But obviously, if you look at Nigeria, for example, that's not, and yet they're both classified as nations. So what this illustrates is that there is a difference that we need to keep in mind at all times between nations and states. Many states encompass more than one nation, like say Belgium, Nigeria, probably most of the world's countries, to be honest. So this creates some difficulties in addressing the question of what counts as Welsh, because are we talking about the civic, political identity, or are we talking about the more ethnic? By the way, when I say ethnic, I do not mean race or anything, but ethnic as in language and culture. Are we speaking about that dimension? And I think a lot of these distinctions get lost in the language being a bit too one size fits all. So yeah, to answer the question about, what counts as Welsh and who would count as having a very strong Welsh identity, does having to speak the Welsh language factor into how much Welsh would you rank? Well, depends altogether on what you actually mean by Welsh. So I don't have a straightforward answer to that question. But as to whether the language is altogether necessary for the identity, well, I'd say in Wales, generally it is, because we've been so politically integrated into England throughout the centuries that we haven't got the same developed sense of civic identity that, say, the Scottish or the Irish have. So, yeah, I'm afraid I can't give you a straightforward yes or no, but I think those are some considerations that we need to put on the table to make these evaluations. But yeah, thanks.
Well, yes, thank you. It was a bit of a nasty question, really, on the whole. Does anyone have a kinder question? Yes, Elena. We can't hear you, you're on mute.
Sorry. Yes, thank you very much. That was really fascinating. And being a linguist, I was wondering on, so to say, more practical ways of proving what you're saying, because, well, linguistic typology shows that languages are different. And while Everett's claims are taken by some linguists with a bit of, well, not a bit of doubt, undoubtedly languages are different and they all carve the reality in a different way. But when it comes to defining the culture via language, it often comes that if you ask about the specificity of a language, it comes often to a smaller bit of example. Like for Welsh would be always said, like the Welsh hiraeth is untranslated, and color terms like glass is something unique. And I was wondering whether you could think of a more systematic way of showing how that could be on a practical way, how one could show this uniqueness of the Welsh language culture link.
Yeah, no, excellent question. That would take tremendous numbers of things like focus groups and maybe forced choice tests when it comes to checking with people, you know, what connotations are triggered by certain words. It would be a very, very lengthy pursuit. But I do think that the analytic arguments found in Wittgenstein's work, for example, do take us quite a long way to be able to see how, if language and thought are inextricably connected and linguistic meaning is use, then I think we can say, basically from our armchairs, that insofar as there are differences across cultures, those differences are going to be captured within the language, more or less, because the language is effectively supervenient on the culture. So I don't think you would necessarily need to prove it word by word or expression by expression, even though it obviously does help for the evidence base. But yeah, I hope that's not too much of a cop-out.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, just a brief thought on that. I mean, it strikes me that bilingualism must make a difference to this as well. You know, I mean, now we're in a situation where, to all intents and purposes, all Welsh speakers are also more or less equally fluent in English, at least, you know, and so that there must be a certain amount of interference in the way that you know, that concepts get linked together, because you're frequently switching from one language to another, and very often called upon to translate from one language to another. You know, that must really make a difference to the. I mean, I know people study these sort of things, but I mean, it strikes me that probably does make a difference there. Mererid, mae gen ti cwestiwn. Wyt ti sy'n gofyn y cwestiwn, neu wyt ti moyn I fi?
Na I fentro, dwi wedi esbonio wrth Rhianwen bod fi'n chwarae rôl myngu heno, felly mae yna chydig bach sŵn. Just meddwl o'n ni, wel, I ddechrau, diolch am gyflwyniad arbennig iawn. Meddwl o'n ni, ac yn y benodol yn y cyd-destun Cymreig, I ba raddau mae Rhianwen yn obeithiol y bydd modd I ni gofleidio yma gwerth gynhwysol neu I ddefnyddio dair di-Simon caredig wrth bod ni'n cyfosod yr gwahaniaethau yma, ynddo fe? Ac o'n i'n meddwl beth o ti wedi gwahanu diwylliant a cenedl fyna yn allweddol yn hyn o beth. Hynny yw, yr her yma sydd gyda ni yng Nghymru I ni gadw Cymru'n un, I gael a seifio Waldo fyna tra'r yr un pryd. Sori, bydd rhaid fi ddiffod, ddim yn siŵr bod chi'n gallu clywed y cefndir erbyn hyn. Wyt ti'n cael y gist o beth sy'n gen i fyna. Meddwl enghraifft yn ddiweddar am raglen oedd Jeremy Bowen yn reit gryf bod iaith Gymraeg yn cadw ni ar wahân. A dwi'n siŵr bod ni gyd yn nifer ar yr alwad hon heno yn gresynu am hynny'n fawr. Na i ddiffod yr sŵn, ffrindiau.
Yn sicr, na, mae ieithoedd, dwi ddim yn newyddion rili bod ieithoedd gwahanol yn creu rhwydiau cymdeithasol, wrth gwrs, ddim jyst ar lefel ymarferol, ond hefyd ar lefel ideolegol. Felly, dwi'n meddwl bod yn bwysig trio cynnal mwy o'r fath drafodiaethau, lle mae modd esbonio i rheini sydd ddim yn siarad y Gymraeg, pam bod siaradwyr yn gweld fel fersiwn eitha pwysig o'i diwylliant nhw, jyst i greu chydig bach mwy o ddealltwriaeth. Ond eto, wel, dwi'n ddim yn gwestiwn ynglyn â'r iaith chwaith, ond wrth gwrs, mae'n rhan o synnwyr cyffredin bod siarad iaith dyw eraill ddim yn neud yn rhwydd iawn i gael pobl allan, ac ydych chi'n gallu deall pan bod pobl yn teimlo rhwystredigaeth, a fel bod nhw wedi cael ei allanoli o'r, wel, gobeithio bod e ddim yn clic, ond mae rhai pobl yn meddwl bod e. So, diolch am y cwestiwn. Dwi'n meddwl bod hwnna'n rhywbeth mae rhaid i ni gyd ystyried wrth drafod pwysig trwyddo diwylliant. Gobeithio gallai hwn agor bach mwy ddrws i hwnna.
Wyt ti'n obeithiol y bydd modd i ni ddal yn yr peth positif cynhwysol hwnna a darbwyllo pobl nad cael allan ydy'r nod, ond cynnwys, ynddo? Hynny yw dydy iaith iaith arall. Mae e wastad yn ogystal â iaith arall, a dyna'r ddadl dwi'n ffeindio hi weithiau'n anodd i argyhoeddi'r beth dwi'n well gen i alw'r meddylfryd uniaethog yn hytrach na'r egolyn.
Yn sicr. Cytuno'n llwyr gyda hwnna. Diolch.
Oeddi ti gallu clywed fi?
Odyn?
Ydyn.
O'r gorau. Fi wedi mwynhau mas draw, diolch i ti Rhianwen. Ond ynglyn â national identity, fel ti'n gwybod fi'n priod os wych yn hir iawn yr Almaenwr, a bod tro fi'n mynd mas i'r Alman, maen nhw'n gweud, di Engländerin is da. Bod fi wedi gweud, ich bin kein Engländerin. Dim sy'n fi. Pam ni mor wanllyd? Oherwydd, ni'n newid. Os bydd rhywun yn siarad Saesneg, ni stopio siarad Cymraeg. Mae rhaid i bobl clywed ni'n siarad Cymraeg. A fel o ti gweud am y ferch na mynd i'r dre a siarad Saesneg, ond ni a ffrindiau neud llun peth. Gynta ni'n mynd i Gyfyrddin neu i Llanelli, ond os ni'n mynd i Abertawe, byddwn ni'n penderfynu dydy ni ddim yn mynd i siarad Cymraeg. Mi eisiau ni cryfau a fod mwy cryf, a fi'n siŵr bod ni wedi dod o fyna, ond eisiau gweud i fi, mi eisiau ni fod mwy cryf. Cryf i ddangos i ni. Na gyd o'n i'n gweud, diolch.
Cytuno'n llwyr, a dwi'n meddwl bod beth oedd yr holl ysgrifenwyr gwahanol yn sôn am yr cymlethdor teog, hynny yw'r inferiority complex, yn cyfrannu rhywsut tuag at esbonio hwnna i ryw raddau. Yn ogystal â'r elfen ymarferol, ond dwi'n meddwl bod yna bendant rhywbeth yn ein profiad casgliadol sy'n argyhoeddi'r agwedd yna. Diolch.
Diolch.
Ydych chi'n gweld, Rhianwen, bod pethau wedi newid rhywfaint yn ddiweddar? Dyna sydd dwi'n teimlo, bod hynny yw bod na fwy o, llai o deimlad ymysg Cymru, felly, bod yr iaith yn rhywbeth sydd ddim yn perthyn i bawb. Fi'n credu bod Jeremy Bowen yn hynny o beth, yn falle nadlewyrchu sydd oedd pethau degawdau nhw pan oedd e'n byw yng Nghymru, siwr iawn, ynddo fe? Ond rhyw deimlad sydd gen i, felly, ond fel rhywun sydd yn astudio'r pethau yma yn fwy gwyddonol, felly, oeddech chi'n gweld bod rhywbeth felly ar droed?
Mae'r nawr, mae ddim fi'r person gorau i ofyn yn hynny o beth, achos nes i rhan fwyaf o fy astudiaethau yn fy mywyd fel oedolyn yn Lloegr. Ond, rhaid bod addysgu'r iaith fel pwnc angenrheidiol mewn ysgolion er enghraifft wedi gwneud tipyn o les. Fel un peth, mae cymaint o gynllunio ieithyddol yn creu gweithgareddau mewn cymunedau ar gyfer pobl i siarad Cymraeg, fel rhan o'r strategaeth Cymraeg 2050. Gobeithio bod hwnna'n gwneud tipyn o wahaniaeth yn hybu pobl i ddysgu mwy a ceisio cael agwedd bach yn fwy cadarnhaol tuag ato fe. Ond dwi ddim yn arbenigol ar agweddau pobl tuag at y Gymraeg, ond mae'n neis iawn clywed bod pobl yn cael y teimlad yna, a gobeithio bydd e'n cynyddu.
It's sort of nearly 8 o'clock here. I don't know if anyone else has a quick question. I can't see any hands up or anything like that. So perhaps we can thank Rhianwen once again for a wonderful presentation. Just before you all disappear, I'd like to just give a quick plug to the final seminar in our series, which will be on the 10th of May, and the speaker will be Will Parker, who is doing a PhD here in Aberystwyth. Now, he has a wonderful title, which I omitted to write down, so I can't remember, but it's about wandering pigs and things like that. So particularly, I believe he'd be talking about the Twrch Trwyth and this sort of thing in medieval literature. I will be advertising this. You'll all be bothered by me with adverts for this and so on in due course. And I hope that some of you will be able to come to that as well. But for tonight, perhaps we can once again thank Rhianwen very much indeed for a wonderful and thought-provoking presentation.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Diolch.